In a very short time, Peter has gone from first to worst, if you follow Matthew's gospel. We heard it just last week, that wonderful, beautiful, miraculous moment, a gift of the Father himself. Jesus said when Peter, in faith, said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," eliciting from the Lord and Master himself the promise which endures even to this day, "Upon this rock I have built my church, and hell will not overcome it." This beautiful, miraculous moment in the life of the church, particularly in the life of St. Peter. Wonderful moment. But that was last week. If you follow on just a few verses from that high point, we come to what we just heard, that moment of conviction. Those hard words it must have been to hear from Jesus, who just a while ago, not too long ago, had said such marvelous things. "Get behind me, Satan." From first to worst. That's part of the story of St. Peter. And we know the rest of the story, of course. Peter had a few more miraculous mess-ups ahead of him. When Jesus was arrested, before the night was out, he had denied him 3 times. Embarrassed, ashamed, weak, In Luke's account of that shameful moment, it's for me the most haunting. The moment he denies him the 3rd time, Jesus catches his eye, There's this brief moment where Jesus and Peter see each other eye to eye, and Peter's destroyed. Peter, even after the resurrection, still was a bit thick sometimes. As we say in Britain, thick as 2 short planks. Paul had to pick a fight with him. If you read Galatians, Peter, I think, gave in to peer pressure. He may have been that sort of guy. Gave in to a little bit of peer pressure, and he didn't want to stand up for the radical truth of the gospel. He gave in to the tribalism, the chauvinism, which had poisoned the infant church. And Paul said, "Then I did oppose him to his face." Peter's an interesting one, much like us, much like me. And I find it strangely comforting, to be honest with you. Peter had this wonderful moment of mystical faith, which inaugurated an eternity of blessing. But he was weak, he was impetuous, he was ridiculous at times. But still, he was given these wonderful spiritual gifts. He was the one on the mountain with James and John when they saw for just a moment the Lord in brilliance with Moses and Elijah. And the comforting thing, as I said, the reason I'm comforted by the strange and career of Peter. You know, he did not have an undefeated season. Because it reminds me what's probably true of most of us. In one moment, you can, have the greatest, most perfect faith. You can say the wisest and truest thing, but give it just a minute or two and you'll likely say something really, really dumb. That's been my experience as a human, as a husband, as a dad, as a priest, as a pastor. Some days I'm the best dad in this building. Some days I'm the worst. And I think that's just reality. I think that's just reality, and it belongs to maturity. It belongs to humility to accept that, to acknowledge that, to not bend the knee at the idol of yourself, but to say, there I am. Peter, he was a good one. Pretty good apostle. He was probably an okay pope, But God did the rest, and that was enough. And so I hope you can easily translate the lesson into your life, You don't have to be perfect. No one wants you to be perfect. You'd be irritating if you were perfect, probably. You're gonna ascend the heights of spiritual comfort sometimes in your life, and then in other times in your life, goodness gracious, it's gonna be not just dark, it's gonna be cold. And that's just normal. That's just the way it is. And that's okay. Now, why in this instance, here in Matthew, why did Jesus say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan"? What was going on there in that moment? In substance, the problem is that Peter didn't understand the gospel. He didn't understand what Jesus was doing, what he was on about. He didn't understand the words and the mighty deeds, to use the term, that he had witnessed. Peter didn't know what it meant. He didn't understand it. He loved Jesus, and he, like any friend, you don't want to see harm come to the people you love. On a very earthly level, it's understandable exactly what Peter's saying. No one's going to do this to you. We're going to take care of you. What are you talking about, getting arrested and crucified? If someone we love in our life said that to us, we would say the exact same thing Peter did. Of course not. It's kind of like if your child, God forbid, in a war, your child comes to you turning 18, said, "I'm going to sign up, I need to fight for my country." The human reaction there is, "No, you don't. You need to stay here with me, right here in my house, and stay here." But we know the greater good. Sometimes it's even more mundane than that, You might send your kid off to Yale or to Notre Dame and spend an enormous amount of money, and then they come back to you and say, I want to teach in South Dallas, or I want to be a nurse in Honduras, and we think, oh my God, I've just spent all this money for that, We want to see our kids successful. We want to see our kids, you know, have the stuff that we didn't have growing up. My kids are my retirement plan, so I hope they choose wisely their careers. But we know that goodness and truth and justice, these greater things, are more important than these small earthly affections, even though they are very important. You know, I want my child to be safe and happy and successful, but I also know that if they have to do the right thing, even at risk, that's okay, you know. That's what Peter, I think, was struggling with. Of course, he didn't want to see Jesus get crucified. He didn't want to see him get arrested because he loves him. But the reason he missed the point, and the reason Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan," is because, you know, at the beginning of his ministry, especially if you read Mark's gospel, Jesus said to the 12, "I give you the secret of the kingdom. I let you know what I'm doing, this kingdom of God that I have brought about." But Peter didn't listen well enough, and he didn't embrace what Paul talked about, which is the transformation of the mind. The transformation of the mind. He didn't let up. He didn't open up. He didn't allow the gray matter to be challenged and shaped by the will of God. He was still thinking in those human ways, which are okay, but they're not the gospel. They're not the kingdom of God. And again, that's the challenge for me. It's the challenge, I think, for us. I don't know about you, but when I read the New Testament, when I read the Gospels, when I think about Jesus, most of the time I feel an enormous distance, almost an alienation between my life and the way I think and what I do and what I know Jesus has called me to do. What I know Jesus has called me to think. The way I know he wants me to live, you know. You know, maybe that's just me. I know the challenge is the renewal of my mind. And that's the spiritual work for me, and I think for a lot of us perhaps, is to really put ourselves in that place where we can be open to that transformation so that we can actually even begin to understand what Jesus is saying and doing and calling us to live into, you know, to be open to that change so that we can finally understand, so that we can finally be the Christians God called us to be. That's the spiritual work, as I said, and I think that is the most important thing I could invite you to take up. Now, the reason Peter is so comforting to me is because I see in him just authenticity and honesty. I see in the New Testament, because I've read it, truth. And I'm comforted ultimately because Peter is a saint. And what made him a saint was not that he really even ever figured it out, because everything I've just told you about, we're going to struggle with, you're going to struggle with, I'm going to struggle with, till the day each one of us dies. We're always going to be like Peter. But the reason Peter's a saint, and the reason you can be a saint, is that Peter didn't give up. He never gave up. He tried. There's that legendary story of him trying to escape Rome, when the persecutions were coming. He tried to leave town, and he bumped into Jesus, who was going toward Rome. And it's that famous question, Quo vadis, where are you going? Peter says to Jesus. And Peter says, in substance, I'm going to get crucified. I don't know where you're going. Peter knew that to be faithful, he had to turn around. And so for you and for me, I think the most important thing is struggle to transform your mind. I'll do the same. Let us struggle to live the gospel in its full potency. But as we're trying, and it's going to be hard, just never, ever give up. Never, ever, ever, ever give up. When you give up, that's when you're done. I always think of the soldiers in World War I. I've used this analogy over and over again. I probably need to find another one. But I think of all those soldiers, in the trenches 100 some odd years ago. They couldn't see anything. They didn't know anything. They'd fight and risk their lives, and they might, if they're lucky, get 10 feet on Tuesday, only to be blown back 30 feet on Wednesday. And it was a war. But and I know, thank God they didn't give up. Even though they didn't see their progress, thank God they didn't give up. And sometimes we're in the trenches, And so the most important thing is don't give up.